Today's guest on Leave Your Mark is Joey Dumont. After his brother's suicide and his narcissistic father embezzled large sums of money from him, Joey realized he had to become a self-described douchebag used as a parade of pretentiousness to mask the pain, anger, and insecurities he was hiding from. He was deploying fashion, discourse, athletics, and other personas to manage his public appearance, physicality, status, expertise, and productivity. He believed when a man looked good and spoke well, little else mattered. Joey, thank you for being our guest on Leave Your Mark here today.
Well, thanks for having me, Vince. I'm stoked.
Hi there, and welcome. Now it's time for America's favorite podcast, Leave Your Mark, with your host, Vince Cortese.
If it's fly, loose fitted, it's Cortese. If freezing, chubbers in it, it's Cortese.
Leave Your Mark is about inspiring the world, one guest at a time.
Pass the word from Brooklyn to Pittsburgh, from urban to suburb, it's Cortese, you heard?
And here is our host, Vince Cortese.
Yeah, this is quite the story. I really would like for you to start on the part where this realization of the type of life you were living came into focus for you. And your story begins and we'll touch on as it moves forward. But at what age are you when you realize, or you're referencing yourself as a self-described douchebag? It's kind of self-deprecating, but it's like, you know, what's going on with this guy? He's not feeling good about himself.
Well, you mentioned my father's embezzlement. My dad is a long story in itself, but when I was 30, we went into business together. And it was a mediation arbitration business. My father was in law school at the time. And so we had an actual plan of helping indigent workers specific to an alternative dispute resolution. So if you're involved in litigation of any kind, you're allowed to mediate these cases. And so we thought we could start a mediation firm. So we did. And about a year into the practice, I received a call from a BMW dealership. And he said, "Hi, Joey, this is Ben from so-and-so Motors, and I need you to come down and co-sign for your dad's new BMW." I said, "Okay, can you put him on the phone, please? That'd be great." And so my dad gets on the phone and he started mewing all these things. I said, "Dad, what are you doing? Are you crazy? We don't have any money. What are you doing buying an $80,000 car?" And I jumped off the phone and then had this really terrible feeling in my gut. So at the time, this is in 1996, I jumped on the phone with our bank to see what our bank balances was. We had a couple different accounts, and it turned out that he'd cleaned out those accounts over the last 6 months, and I wasn't paying attention to him because detail wasn't my strongest suit. And so at that point in my life, I realized that I was now over $100,000 in debt. The money I borrowed from family and friends, college buddies, betrayed by my dad. And we were in LA when this happened. So I drove back to Northern California where I lived and tried to figure out what am I going to do with my life? I'm 30 years old. I no longer have a business. My father and I no longer have a relationship. I had a Range Rover that I couldn't even afford to sell. So I had to get rid of that, but I couldn't. And then about 2 weeks later, there was a yellow eviction notice posted on my home. So my dad had not paid the rent after I paid him the rent. He just kept it. So then I was soon to be homeless. And from that point, when you lose everything you have, you really don't have anything to touch. So for me, it was like, I don't have a job. I don't have a paycheck. I don't have a title. I don't have a home. And I don't have a relationship with my father anymore. So that was the wake-up call, Vince. That was the one that that was the one that shook me pretty hard.
That's seriously heavy, because I mean, you're talking about all of the things that give us our identity and
Correct.
Our level of, you know, besides who we are in this world, but our level of confidence and how we're going to move forward. So this is serious. Now, was at this time, you said you were 30. At what age were you when your brother committed suicide?
I was 40. So that was 10 years later.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, all right. Now, so then at 30, you got pretty much some life under your belt, and then all this, the bottom drops out.
Yeah.
When do you go into this recovery? Because I mean, your self-analysis was right on I mean, things had fallen out for you, but moving forward, what was your starting point?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that go on with your mental, right? So people talk about psychotic collapse and mental illness and depression and anxiety, and all those things kind of hit me at the same time. So when I had nothing, I went to my best friend Kimmy's house and I said, hey, this just happened. And I probably spent 2 weeks previous to that binge eating because I didn't know what else to do. And I went to her house and she said, baby, you gotta study about this. There's something going on in your head right now. And this is called episodic depression. And you may want to start doing something called meditating, which I didn't know. And so I went to a little place called Spirit Rock in Northern California. And it was all these really sweet people sitting on orange pillows, meditating. And it's just absolute beautiful center. It's out in the middle of nowhere, trees and hills, and very serene and wonderful. And I just couldn't connect because I didn't understand it. And my mind was just raging, right? It was just, you are a loser. You're never going to recover from this. Everyone else in the world's doing better than you. And that was just this very loud narrative that was kind of circling through my brain like a merry-go-round. And so what happened, just by happenstance, is I went skiing with some of my buddies to get away from everything. And we started rock climbing. We went to Jackson Hole and we skied, and we went indoors and started rock climbing in this little indoor gym. And what I immediately found was that when you're on a wall, even indoors, was that you are myopically focused on keeping yourself on that wall. And so mind, body, and spirit were all aligned, possibly for the first time in my life. And I fell in love with rock climbing. And so from that, I came back from my ski trip, signed up for a gym, started rock climbing every single day. And I had nothing to do. I was unemployed and broke. So it was like, here we go. What are you going to do all day? So I climbed 3, 4, 5, 6 hours a day. Then I started meeting up with guys at the gym who were huge rock climbers, and we started going outside. And so we went out to these cliffs, big cliffs, and we went up to Yosemite and we started climbing, and that was a life changer. It was, you focus on the cliff or the coffin. There's 2 choices. You don't really have any. And these guys were all living in vans, eating tuna out of cans, chili out of cans, didn't care about a job, never asked me once what I did for a living. So I just fell in love with this whole lifestyle. And I spent a lot of time on the mountain. I spent a lot of time reading texts and scripts that I'd never heard of, the Bhagavad Gita, the Tripitaka, the Quran. I mean, I just read every spiritual text I could get my hands on to try to understand what was going on through my brain and what was going on, in my world, because my world, as you mentioned, had collapsed. My whole focus, my whole life, and I think I mentioned this to you when we first met, was that, if your heroes are assholes, who are you and who do you become? And when I was young, and my first couple of years in college, I remember looking up to guys like Steve Jobs and Larry Ellison and Bill Gates. And I even read Art of the Deal by Donald Trump. And I thought all of these men were guys that I want to emulate. And if you look back on the history of these guys, yes, they were very smart, genius level men, sans Mr. Trump, of course. And they did really good things on the business world. But were they good men? Were they good husbands? Were they good fathers? Were they good to the community? And the answer was really not exactly, right? So I think that was a piece of where I was like, oh, okay, I need to look up to different people. And in my homework that year, I began to look up to different people for the first time. And that was when I was 30.
Wow. Now, you mentioned that you had your own business prior to all of this too. So, I mean, you'd come out through, it sounded like through your 20s, you were pretty successful to this point. And, successful enough for your father to lean in on you for money and those bigger decisions on finances.
Connect with us on LinkedIn. Be our friend on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram.
Whether jumping out the MP or jumping on the app.
You are listening to Vince Cortese. We just want you to leave your mark.
Now you've come through this window, you're in the rock climbing is very intriguing because nature has an interesting way of touching our internal selves. So when you begin then to redefine yourself, really, you're looking for role models and so forth. how did reading these books and the rock climbing really kind of come together to start directing you to a more positive path, or where you were going to lead to the next phase of your life?
It's a great question. I think that, someone asked me once, what is your personal power? And my answer quickly was love. I didn't think about it. I genuinely love people. And his next question was like, all right, what is love to you? And I said, attention. All right, well, what's attention? Well, attention is presence. You're there in the moment. And he's like, okay, and what's presence to you? And I said, peace of mind, right? And that was the lesson I learned in that period, was that when you read anything, any of the text I mentioned, if you read authors like Alan Watts or Eckhart Tolle, or Paramahansa Yogananda was another guy that I followed clearly, and I loved him. And he wrote a book called The Autobiography of a Yogi. And then there's, Alan Watts and Anthony DeMilo and all of these wonderful spiritual writers. And everything that you read, or everything that I read, I should say, led back to the same thing. They were all maps to the same destination, which was presence. So if you're a Catholic, if you're a Muslim, if you're a Hindu, if you're any of these people, all of those scripts, and they're all beautiful and well crafted, but they're maps, right? They're maps to the same destination. And I think part of what I learned is that it's not a goal to become a master of the maps. It's not a goal to become a master of quoting scripture and saying, this is the way to presence or to God or to consciousness or to whatever word you want to use for inner peace. And when I got there for the first time, it stopped the noise. And that was the biggest moment in my life, because I realized, like, I am not my stuff. I'm not my car. I'm not my suits. I'm not my cool ties. I'm not my overpriced shoes. And if I'm not those things because I lost all of those things, then what am I? And that's that existential question that I think a lot of us go through. And I would say right now, in times of COVID, there's a lot of people going through this themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Whether it's a loss of a job, or their friends have lost jobs, or you have this just, societal sickness and literally sick, right? Where we have this, oh my God, there's a lot of people suffering out there, and it has an effect on you. So the idea is, how can you get to presence? How can you stay, what I call dropping in? Flow is another word that people use. How do you get to flow in your career, with your marriage, with your, parenting, with your friendships, all of those things? And I learned the beginning of those lessons in that period. And then, just to be clear, I was in such deep debt that about a year later, I decided that I had to get back to work in corporate America. And I went back to work.
This is after all rock climbing and so forth?
Yeah, after a year of living in vans, rock climbing and reading spiritual texts, and actually calming down to the best place I'd ever been in my life. I went right back to corporate America, took a big sales job, started making a bunch of money again, and went right back to it. Bought suits, cars, worried about what I was doing, how I was keeping up with the Joneses. And that took place. We were laughing about getting to a place of comfort, but that whole decade, my 30s, was all about, being successful, heavy quotes. And I got into the advertising business.
Okay.
And I spent the next 18 years in that space, which fortunately I really loved. But I got back into a lot of materialism, a lot of distraction, right? And you mentioned when my brother passed away in 2007, it was another way of shaking you, right? That's the world shaking you. And that was where I needed to wake up again.
Now that's extremely heavy. Now, how close were you to in age?
He was 6 years my junior. My older brother is 11 months older. And we have always been really good friends. So my dad split us up when we were kids, which is another one of his narcissistic moves. But after we got back together, we never fought. So my little brother was, my little dude, and he always looked up to me because I was his older brother. We were great friends, and he was a drug addict and an alcoholic. He started drinking when he was about 10 because of a lot of my dad's abuse, and he just couldn't deal with it. And so his distraction was drugs and alcohol. And over the years, he was in and out of rehab centers, in and out of jail, just a mess.
Up to his suicide, was there indicators that he would do that? Because that kind of lifestyle.
Oh, yeah. For sure.
Okay, so then
Yeah.
was it a surprise then that happened, or that was kind of like an inevitable thing because you almost saw it coming?
Yeah, no, it's an astute observation. I think that I made reference to this with my mom and my brother. I said, I never expected Stevie, who was my little brother, I never expected him to live long. And he had numerous other circumstances where he'd rolled cars because he was drunk. He had numerous DUIs. He had a lot of problems. And so I just didn't think he was going to live long. And the amount of alcohol he consumed, his liver alone would have crapped out before he was my age. I'm 54 now. He never would have made it that far.
How old was he when he committed suicide?
He was 34.
Oh, wow.
And so and this is a topic that took us a while to figure out, specifically with my family. My mom didn't want to admit this, and neither did I, and neither did my brother. But as I went to therapy for it, we found out that my brother was huffing. So I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but huffing is aerosol cans. They had this refrigeration propellant inside.
Okay.
And you inhale it. And when you do so, it shuts up all the oxygen in your brain and it gets you really stoned.
Oh, wow.
For a long period. So it's maybe 3-4 hours of just, you got nothing going on. And he'd been doing that for a while. And there's a 27% chance of dying the first time you huff. So depending on how your brain is set up and your own body composition, it's very dangerous to do. And he'd been doing it for a while, and we didn't know that. And I brought him out to San Francisco in April 1st of 2007 to live with me. I was doing very well financially, and so I could afford to support him. I was going to get him his own place. He'd been clean, at least he shared that with us, for probably 3 or 4 months, which was a long time for him. So my brother and I were very excited to have him with us. And I brought him to my office. I was working in advertising at that point. And he went to lunch with our team, and we had a great time eating cheeseburgers on the dock here in San Francisco. And then I said, I'm going to go for a motorcycle ride, dude, and I'll see you when I get home. And he said, I love you, dude, and I love you too. And we hugged it out. And I went for a motorcycle ride after work. And when I came home, I walked in the door and I said, what's up, dude? And I didn't hear anything. So I walked into the bathroom because he liked to take baths. And so I walked into the bathroom and he was floating upside down, and he was blue and purple, and he was dead. And so I did what most people do. I screamed, no, as loud as I've ever heard my own voice before. And he weighs 200 pounds, so he's a big kid. So I pulled him out of the tub and attempted to resuscitate him through mouth to mouth. And I tasted Tums and wine. So he went and got drunk. And then I noticed a aerosol can perched on the sink. So he was doing that as well.
He was huffing.
And then he OD'd. And so they call this indirect suicide. And when you do this over and over again, it's your way out, right? It's your distraction. So it wasn't like he hung himself or he, took his own life with a gun or anything like that. But as I went to therapy to figure out what this was, they called it indirect suicide, and he wanted out. And he's told me numerous times he wanted out. So it was just one of those things I had to get over and feel bad, because I remember even laying over his body crying. And I said, buddy, I'm so sorry life was so hard for you. And I had this immediate feeling of relief, which made me feel really guilty and shitty. And I spent plenty of time on a couch talking to a therapist about that. But what happened, and what I found out later through study, is that when you have an addict in your family, and specifically a long-term addict, every time the phone rings, you worry that it's them, that something happened to them. And because he lived in Minnesota most of his life, anytime the phone rang after 9 or 10 o'clock, I assumed it was my little brother going to jail. It was my mom crying because he'd OD'd again. And he'd been in so many DUIs that if he got another one, he was actually going to a federal prison.
Oh, boy.
And my little brother was just this happy-go-lucky, sweet kid. He wouldn't have survived in prison. So I think that was where the whole release thing came from, is that at least he's at peace.
Uh-huh.
I loved him so much that I didn't want him to be in that much pain anymore. And that was kind of the that was a wake up moment for me about, I have to get rid of my distractions too. I have to. And I remember walking home, around my street after the funeral, and I was talking to myself in my head, and it said, there is no next, Joey. You learned that when you were 30. And what my brain was telling me is that there is no next other than now.
Yeah.
If you're not present, if you're not here, when you're playing with your kids, are you playing with your kids? Are you watching them push their little toys around, and you watching them smile? Are you watching them interact with one another? Are you there? Are you present? And, a lot of times you're not. You're thinking about a deal you got going on, or you got to go pick up your wife, or you got to go do this, and you got all these duties, as an adult. But one thing Stevie taught me was I need to be present. And that's something that he was incapable of doing, because his presence, his now, was so full of anxiety and depression and regret, and he just couldn't deal with it. And so because he couldn't deal with it, he looked for alternatives, which were in this case, drugs and pills and weed and whatever else he could
Whatever
consume.
he could get his hands on, really.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
I mean, there's really no way to describe the emotions, in words we'd all understand, other than having experienced it like you did. So at this point in 2007, it sounds like you had started to pull yourself back together. How do you pivot from this position of enormous loss and tragedy to the person you now are, really being in touch with yourself and your inner feelings in the present? How does the rebuilding of Joey begin to happen here?
Well, the next year was a blur. As I mentioned, I was in the ad business. My business partners and I had offices in New York, San Francisco, and LA. And my two business partners were happily married with kids. And so it was kind of up to me to be jumping back and forth between the offices. And I was the pitch guy. So when we pitch a new client on a creative project, it was me and a group of colleagues, and we'd fly around the country and pitch these brands about how we were going to handle their campaigns and do all this cool stuff. And that year, I spent most of my time on a jet pitching, going out to New York to drink. I went out a lot and drank too much. Spent a lot of time with women as a distraction. And I don't remember a lot of that year, but my partner, Jeff, sat me down about a year in. He said, dude, I love you. You got to get some help. You're a mess, and you're not yourself. You're not doing this agency any good. You're not doing yourself any good. You got to fix this. And that was a part of it. So fortunately, that talk shook me, and I kind of stopped, or at least pulled back on the drinking, and eventually went to therapy, which also coincided with me meeting my then girlfriend and my now wife. And she, being a very, let's just say, upstanding citizen. My wife has never touched drugs. She doesn't drink. She's never smoked. She just a very wonderful human being on all fronts. And when we fell in love, she said, hey, I love you, and I love your heart, and I love your brain, but you need to figure these things out. I'm not marrying an addict. I'm not marrying someone who's going to distract himself with alcohol and drugs. And so I started therapy, and that's where it all began. It was like that. I spent 8 years on a couch with a highly trained therapist who in the initial session said to me, does your father do this? And did your father do that? And did your father say this? And I was like, how did you know this? And she was like, well, these are, your father sounds like he suffered from narcissistic personality disorder. And so I'm assuming you have some fallout from that. And she was right. And as we started to unpeel that, over the next 8 years, that was a long-term remedy, but it took place. And as that happened, I started to realize that, wow, the reason my wife's in love with me is not because I have a big paycheck or nice clothes or fancy cars or a nice home. It's that she loves me. And so maybe I should start to love me too,
That'd be a good idea, right? At that point.
Yeah. And then I started reading the spiritual books again, and it was during that period where I realized, like, oh, okay, this is my home. And then fortunately for us, we got married and we had 2 little boys. And my boys are 9 and 7 at this point. And when 2017, my best childhood friend was killed in a car accident.
Oh, man.
And his wife called me and said, Joey, can you deliver the eulogy? And she asked me to do this because my brother, Paul, is also his best friend until the day he died. But my brother suffers from chronic depression. He's not overly happy. And she said, her name is Jolene, and she said, Joey, I want you to make it Joey funny. Can you make the church laugh on this dark day? And I said, yes. I can share stories of Jay's love for, Lord of the Rings and Monty Python. And he was a doctor, and he was so smart that everything he said was over my head. So I kind of went with that as a shtick and got the church to laugh. And as I was writing the eulogy, I realized that if this same fate were to befall me, my little boys would know who I was. They would hear from my wife that, oh, your daddy loved you so much, and he coached your teams, and he was a good husband and a good friend and a good son. And that would be the extent of it. They wouldn't really know much about my father. They wouldn't know much about my decades-long struggle with insecurity and episodic depression and chronic anxiety. And then all of the, kind of laughable things that come along with that as far as behaviors. And so I decided to write a memoir. And I told my wife, I'm going to take the next year off my career, and I'm going to write this memoir, which was originally going to be kind of an Anthony Bourdain-esque memoir about my drinking, my carousing, my arrogance, which was sheltering my insecurity. And as I began to write, that stuff didn't come out. What came out was my insecurity. And so I would then, let's write about that. And so the book became almost a parody of myself, where I'm making fun of my behavior and trying to use some laughter around behaviors. As an example, when I first started making money, I remember buying $2,000 custom-made suits because I wanted to be that cool guy. And I bought a Porsche, and I bought silly things that I didn't need, and all to impress people, just nameless, faceless people. It wasn't to impress my friends because they didn't really care. Yeah. And so I wrote a book called Joey Somebody, The Life and Times of a Recovering Douchebag. And the first 4 chapters are pretty heavy because it deals with my father, my little brother's suicide, my mom remarrying a raging alcoholic, and all the fun that comes with that. But chapters 5 through 25 are me making fun of me and having fun with that. And so there's very few things more cathartic than actually putting your insecurities in writing on paper and being honest about it. And then my brother, Paul, I brought him in as a co-writer probably a year into the project because I'm not a great writer. I was a good storyteller from my industry in the ad world, but my brother is a law professor, and he teaches legal reasoning and writing and has a master's degree in writing composition. And so we sat and did this together for the next 2.5 years. And that was really cool too, because we got to actually get out a lot of our insecurities around our dad, how he treated our mother, how he treated us, how he treated our little brother. And so that was a really good experience. And all of these things together, Vince, is why I can actually say, for the first time in my life, as a 54-year-old man, I'm present well over 50% of my life now. That's where I'm playing with my kids, I coach.
It's actually great news. I think that your writing of the book and allowing yourself, how much of that served as therapy? Because you're sitting here being on a psychiatrist's couch, and the book was probably more stimulating and more invigorating for you to find yourself and to be present, and the experiences that you had prior, pulling in, I think that rock climbing thing and finding your inner peace was huge. And this sounds like it almost kind of tops all of that understanding off, finding a good woman that grounded you even further, good advice from a boss and a friend. and here you write a book.
If you are listening from Australia, Florida, or just from around the corner,
From East Coast to West Coast outlets, if you're not to the dirty South straight, make a left and body.
contact us. Leave your mark with your host, Vince Cortese.
Now, you've gone even beyond that. So you're a podcaster yourself. You're an author.
Yeah, just started.
Now,
Yep,
how is now? Just kind of bring us up into where you currently have arrived after the book writing.
Sure. I think that the therapy was necessary in a linear fashion. So there was a wonderful woman named Mary Carr who teaches memoirists at Syracuse University. And she's written 3 memoirs of her own, which are wonderful. And then she also wrote a book called The Art of Memoir. And in it, she gives her students, and then me in this case, because I bought her book, here's the things you need to do to write a memoir. And one thing she mentions, and I'm paraphrasing her here, but she said, make sure if it's a traumatic memoir that you've done your therapy. Because if you haven't, this could trigger you and you could be a mess. And so I've been there. I was like, check that box. I've done lots of therapy, so I'm in good shape and I feel good about myself. But thank God I had the warning, and thank God I had the therapy, because I had never talked about my little brother's death before, ever. A couple friends, obviously, but when I sat down to write it, it was the first time that I had freeze frames that are still there, still very active, that I could pull from, and I started to write. And as I was writing, I was just sobbing through this. And It took me probably 2 weeks to actually write it all out. And every time I write, I would sweat. I would like go into the flow, and I would come out maybe an hour later, and I would be, my hands were shaking and my body was sweaty, and I was a mess. So I was just trying to get this out. And so her advice was astute in that you need therapy. And then she also said you need to be honest, because the reader will know if you're lying. Do not make up, additional stuff within your story that may be enticing, or it may be something that you think the reader wants, because the reader wants truth, your truth.
Yeah.
And so to be honest in every aspect of the writing was also really cool, because I had such experiences that I didn't really need to manufacture anything, right? I had such a lunatic for a father and my brother and I had so much fun ripping on my dad. Just to be clear.
Well, that was therapy too, though. I mean,
oh my God.
Getting that out and in a public manner. I mean, that in itself is an enormous release. I mean,
it was. We would laugh out loud about how we'd rip on my dad. I mean, and there's so much goodness in there. He passed away in 2011, so I didn't have to worry about it. And pieces of us were like, God, I wish he was alive to read this. He'd be so mad. But I actually got to the point where through therapy, I forgave my dad. I told him that. He didn't understand. When I did tell him, I said, Daddy, I love you. And I just want to let you know I forgive you for all the abuse and for everything you did to my little family. And he just looked at me and he said, for what?
Wow.
And I said, it doesn't matter, dude. I just want you to know this is for me. It's not for you.
Yeah.
You're not going to understand it. And when he passed, he hadn't changed. My dad was the kind of person, and I mean this even as someone who's forgiven him, that the world is a better place without him. He was so toxic and awful to everyone. He had no friends ever. His funeral was his twin brother and his sister, who love him dearly, and they're great people, by the way. But there was no one there, because my dad took from everyone he met. He manipulated everyone he met to get something from them for himself. He never cared about anybody else, including us. And that was something too, when you understand that your dad didn't love you, it wasn't because you did anything wrong as a kid. And that's a hard pill to swallow when you're going through therapy. It's like, hey, your dad didn't love you. How do you deal with that? They're like, ugh. Because by nature, my dad left when we were 8, and he just could not handle the whole parental thing, right? And in hindsight, I look back on that because my brothers and I were 7 and 8 when he split, and my kids are 9 and 7. So my brother said to me while we were writing this, he even looked at me once. He said, "Okay, Joe, this is when you leave." And I didn't even understand what he was talking about. I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "This is when you bail right now. Go get your suitcase and leave. That's what our dad did. And I was like, holy shit, dude, I never thought of that, because I'm a dad now, right? And
Oh, wow.
I'm so involved with my kids, and they're the biggest part of my life, especially the last 4 years that I've been a stay-at-home dad, writing this book, supporting my executive wife in any way I can. They're my whole life. And so, and while I'm thinking of it, there's a podcaster named Dax Shepard, who's an actor and comedian, and the guy who's gone through his own journey, whose papa left him, and then he became a father, and he had these kind of the same like comparative narrative here. And he said, I used to get mad at my dad because he left. And he goes, and then when I became a dad, I realized, like, oh my God, it was my dad that missed out.
Yeah.
And I never thought of it that way. It was such a cool way to flip it, right? That because like I get to be with my little boys all the time, right? I take them to school. This is pre-COVID, but I drive them to school. I pick them up. I coach their basketball teams. I coach their baseball teams. I coach their soccer teams. I was active. I was a dad that was present. I was hugging them. I was disciplining them. I was coaching them. I was loving them. That was my gift, right? That it isn't about anything other than I got to do that, right? And that was a big shift in my brain too. It was like, oh, not only can I forgive my dad, I can now feel sorry for him. He didn't get to do that, right? He didn't get to experience being a father, and it was a really cool way to shift that. If I ever do meet Dax Shepard, I'm going to hug him. Say, dude, love you. Thank you for that. That was such a great insight.
What I find interesting is through the tragedy of your relationship with your dad, it's actually enabled you to be a better father yourself, because you're checking down the details. You're realizing the time to leave, and it's like, no, it actually isn't the time to leave. It's the time to step up. You're active, exactly. You're involved, you're a coach, you're driving them to school. And it's amazing how life has a unique way of going in a circle and giving us more than one chance, more than two, as many chances as we're willing to give ourselves. And you've done an incredible job here, because it's just one saddening, tragic story after another, and you look great, you sound great, your head is in the right place, you are present, and your self-deprecating title of your book is more for fun and is not necessarily applicable. It's a great hook though, because you're an advertising guy, so it's a great hook.
Douchebag, it is a good hook, and
that's one of those words that grabs your ear.
It's true.
No, you're definitely, but so you basically in a large way is redefined masculinity. Men are always supposed to be stoic and strong and things like this in our culture and how we're raised to think we're supposed to be. And your experience was none of that until now it's your turn, and you're getting to rewrite that. Not just in a book, but in your behavior and your presence.
That's a great point. And that's actually to touch back to, and I get lost in my own verbal diarrhea sometimes, but you asked me about the podcast, and I wrote the book and started the podcast for the same reason. It's a platform to do exactly what you just talked about, which is to normalize these discussions around depression, anxiety, because it's always been there, right? There's different schools of thought. There's different calculations on scale, but 30% of our population suffers, and that's one of those pieces where. And that's depression. So then there's anxiety, and there's all these different, flavors of neuroses. And we're not talking about it as a culture. And it's not something that, to your point around masculinity, I was brought up in Minnesota, God's country, as my cousins call it. And it wasn't a discussion. Men didn't talk about being, frightened by the world sometimes, or feeling that they just weren't enough and they needed to be more stoic, more whatever, more John Wayne, more James Bond, depending on who you're looking at. And so the podcast for me is about interviewing others that are going through the same thing. And it's both men and women. But my first guest was procured. I actually did a very long search to find a guest that I thought would encapsulate all these things best. And it was a friend of a friend who is a showrunner for the television show Fuller House. And if you don't know what the term showrunner means, it means executive producer. There was 200 people employed in producing that show, and he was the one who ran that group. And his name is Brian Behar. And the only reason I know him, and we became friends on Facebook a 3 years ago, is that he's a prolific writer on his father's suicide, his own chronic depression and anxiety and binge eating. And he does the same thing I am tempted to do in my book, is he makes fun of himself in his articles. He's a wonderfully gifted writer. You'll laugh out loud every time you read one of his articles. And he wrote for HuffPo and Medium and a couple other really cool pubs. And so I read probably 45 of his articles. I listened to him on a couple of his podcasts. And I was like, that's the dude. That's my go-to guy. That's the guy I want for my first podcast. And that took place on January 8th. It hasn't even been released yet. But the reason I share that story with you is that goes back to the heroes. When my kids watch the show, I want them to see men and women that are battling and kicking ass in spite of it, not because it didn't exist. And Brian is one of those guys. And he's currently unemployed because the show ended. And then COVID hit the Hollywood production stuff pretty hard. And so we talk about his unemployment. We talk about his father's suicide. We talk about his depression. And we do so with laughter. Like, we laugh with each other. And it's not like, suicide is funny. It's not like depression is funny. But, when you do binge eat 4,000 calories at 2 a.m. by yourself, if you can look at that and laugh a little bit, okay, this is kind of funny. I'm eating a burrito over the sink, at 2 a.m. And there's not even anybody up. So, like, why am I hiding in the kitchen? At least go to the living room and enjoy the TV. It's just kind of like I'm eating because I'm trying to satiate something, right? The cortisol in my brain needs more companionship. But that was the whole point of the podcast. And, we spent 2 hours in this freewheeling conversation about dark things that we shine some light on, right? And so the same thing, I have 2 other guests scheduled for February, both men in this case, who wrote memoirs about anxiety and depression, and attempted to use one of them actually attempted to use some laughter and some humor on his journey as well. And he was a young man, he's a millennial, and he makes jokes about how people don't like millennials and that they're spoiled and trophy kids and, all of that stuff. And so I'm really looking forward to this platform because I do think it will do what I'm hoping it will do, which is shine light on the darkness and make people feel less alone. And one of the big things for me is that if I can laugh at myself, which I've proven to do through the book and the podcast, is that then people can laugh at me, which is cool. And then they might be able to laugh at themselves.
Yeah.
And then we're at that point where, okay, so we're all laughing with each other now, as opposed to at one another, because we're all the same, right? I don't know if you saw that.
We're all seeking that happiness and that security.
Yeah. And if you saw the Super Bowl yesterday, one of my favorite ads was the M&M's ad. And they've had this very cool sequential campaign for years about being eaten. Like, I don't want to get eaten. And so it's one of those things where someone wiser than me said, we're all M&Ms because we all have a different colored shell, but we're all chocolate in the middle, right? And so the idea there is that if we're all suffering, which at some capacity we all suffer, we all have days where
for sure
the world's too much, right?
Yep.
And if you can go someplace or read something that makes you feel less alone, that's the goal. And I think part of what this is for me too is I've been fortunate in my career and my life, so I could take off time and do this. A project I said was going to take a year has now taken almost 4 years. So my very patient wife continues to support me and knows that I'm doing this for the right reasons. It's the first thing I've ever done that's non-transactional, Vince.
Wow.
as a sales guy, and then people say, oh, bullshit, Dumont, there's no way you didn't do this with money in mind. And I'm like, okay, well, let's look at that logically. I left a career as a senior level sales executive in the advertising business to write a book that I have no business writing because I'm not a writer. So that's not going to happen. Self-published books, there's 1 million of them a year. Maybe one sells more than 10 copies. So I'm not going to make any money on the book. Oh, and then I'm going to start a podcast. Oh, okay. Do you know anything about podcasts? No, I don't. Okay, great. So how are you going to make a living? I have no idea, right? But the purpose was the book is out, the podcast is up, and even if I have to go back to corporate America, I can still podcast. I can still do it once a week. It's not a big deal. It was the amount of effort that went into this as far as producing content and writing out my story and attempting to do so that it was funny and entertaining. And then obviously there's allegory and lessons and things that can be gleaned from the narrative. I'm done with that part now. So I'm actually looking forward to the next couple of years.
This is great.
Of sharing. Yeah.
Wow. All right. What is the name of the podcast?
It's called Laugh Your Cry Out.
Laugh Your Cry Out. And the name of the book?
Joey Somebody, The Life and Times of a Recovering Douchebag.
Wow. It's tremendous advertising. I'm in the industry, so I totally love it.
If you have a story to share, tell us. How are you going to leave your mark? Contact us. Leave your mark with our host, Vince Cortese. Be our guest.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing your story today. And I really appreciate you being here. And this is my final question. How would you like to leave your mark in this life?
Oh, well, this sounds pretentious, but I've been accused of worse things. I actually hope that this platform starts a movement. I actually hope that other people adopt the same approach where they just start getting on, whether it's a podcast or a book or on any platform, and just talk about them, what they're going through. And when they do so, they'll find out that there's a community out there that loves them and embraces them. And we, as a culture, become less divided and less tribal and more of, again, accepting each other for what we're doing and who we are and that kind of thing. So that's the goal. That's what I'd like to see happen.
I love it. That's outstanding. What an amazing story, Joey.
Well, thanks for having me, dude. This was cool.
I really appreciate you being on. We could have talked a lot longer. There's so many details there. And I really enjoyed the part about you talking about being present, because this is something that's really important in our society right now. And I believe you're spot on all of the things you're intending on doing with your experience. So what I do want to do is just get the information so that the listeners can get access to you and what it is you're up to and what you're doing. And again, I want to thank you for being here and giving me your time. That was wonderful. I loved it.
Thanks. My website's pretty easy. It's Joey Dumont, or it's joeydumont.com. So if they want to go to the book or the podcast, it's just joeydumont.com, and it has everything on there as far as the book, the podcast, that kind of stuff. Okay. But that's how they can do it.
All right. We'll put that on the links. And again, I appreciate you being here. So that's all for today. Thanks for listening to Leave Your Mark today. Tune into our next episode of Leave Your Mark with Vince Cortese. Be blessed.
You just left your mark. Thanks for listening. Listen to more episodes on demand. Just click Leave Your Mark with Vince Cortese.